Some stories are not buried. They are chained to the bottom of the ocean, alongside the bones of millions, whispering truths the world still refuses to hear. This is not just a story about slavery. It is a story about power, about greed, about the deliberate destruction of identity, of memory, of entire civilizations. From the coasts of Angola to the rice fields of Georgia, from the gold-rich rivers of Ghana to the silent plantations of Cuba, a continent bled, not by chance, but by design. This was not just human trafficking. It was a business, a religion, a science, a genocide. Packaged in profit, baptized in hypocrisy, and shipped across 3 continents. One of the first English slave ships was named the Jesus. Yes, the good ship Jesus. Its full name? The Jesus of Lübeck, a royal warship turned merchant vessel, named after the Savior, used to deliver suffering. This is the true story of the Atlantic slave trade, not the version in schoolbooks, not the version wrapped in diplomacy, but the version history tried to forget. The end of the slave trade, what they never wanted you to understand. In the 1400s, the kingdoms of Europe stared across the ocean and saw opportunity. Portugal and Spain were the first to conquer new lands in the West. Plantations, vast and fertile. But they needed labor. Thoughtful, lots of it. They turned first to the indigenous people of the Americas. But violence, disease, and overwork wiped out entire populations. So the colonial empires looked across the sea toward Africa. Africa, a continent rich in culture, kingdoms, and people. And the Europeans didn't arrive to admire the art. They arrived with contracts, with muskets, with crosses, and with ships. The Vatican itself issued a decree in 1455, granting Portugal the right to enslave non-Christians. Faith became fuel. Slavery sanctified. By the 1500s, African labor was the beating heart of the colonies, and the system was growing. By 1526, the first transatlantic slave voyage had launched. Within decades, it was a roaring trade. Ships out, chains in, gold back. This would become the most brutal economic engine in history. But Africans were not just victims. They were warriors, kings, farmers, mothers. They resisted. They fled. They fought. Yet wave after wave, the tide was too strong, the guns too many, the profits too high, and the lies too easy to believe. Many Europeans never set foot past the African coast. They let disease do the work. Instead, they built forts and paid African middlemen to do the capturing. These were not just criminals or outsiders being taken. They were musicians, scholars, blacksmiths, parents. Whole civilizations emptied to feed the hunger of sugar. By 1600, the machine was unstoppable. The Middle Passage had become a pipeline of pain. 12 million men, women, and children were packed like cargo, stacked like firewood, sold like property. And so the voyage began. This was the Middle Passage, the second leg of the triangular trade, and the most brutal. They were packed in like firewood, stacked shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, chest to back, chained together. Men, women, children. Each given less space than a coffin. Each with no light, no air, no escape. Some voyages lasted 6 weeks, others up to 4 months. Sickness spread like fire. The air stank of sweat, vomit, blood, and rot. There were no bathrooms, no beds, no silence. Just prayers and death. To the slavers, these were not people. They were inventory, property. They were force-fed horse beans and rice, given water by the ounce, beaten if they cried, flogged if they prayed. And every morning the dead were thrown overboard, tied to cannonballs. Historians estimate at least 1.5 million Africans died in the Middle Passage. Some say more. Others were driven to madness. Some jumped willingly, believing that the ocean would return them to their ancestors. They called it the door of no return. But the ocean kept no names, only bones. These weren't just bodies. They were people. Mothers, fathers, daughters who braided hair, sons who knew how to carve drums. What was stolen was not just labor. It was language. It was rhythm. It was culture. It was memory. In one account, captains noted their losses not in lives, but in profit margins. A boy was worth £25, a young woman, £35, a strong man, £50. But the real cost can't be written in ledgers, only in scars. The Middle Passage was not just a journey. It was an era of terror, an oceanic silence that echoes still. They were never meant to be remembered. They were meant to be erased. But the ocean never forgets. And yet, their names became currency. The triangular trade, the business of human flesh. It was called the triangular trade. But let's be honest, it wasn't a triangle. It was a machine, and its fuel was flesh. Europe sent guns, cloth, and alcohol to Africa. Africa sent captives to the Americas. The Americas sent sugar, tobacco, rice, coffee, and cotton back to Europe. 3 sides, 1 truth. Every corner of that triangle was built on blood. What many don't realize is this: the Industrial Revolution didn't just run on steam. It ran on slave-grown cotton, on sugar harvested in chains, on profits from free labor. Banks, insurance companies, ports, shipping guilds. Entire industries grew fat off human cargo. A healthy male slave in 1780 could fetch up to $1,200 in today's money. That's 1 human. Now multiply that by 12 million. That's not a tragedy. That's a business model. Even nations that claimed to be civilized wrote slavery into their laws, debated it in their parliaments, and built universities and churches with the profits. In Liverpool, in Bristol, in Nantes, Lisbon, Amsterdam. Ports boomed, fortunes were made, not in spite of slavery, because of it. And in Africa, a dark mirror formed. Some kings, chieftains, and merchants saw opportunity. Rival tribes were raided, prisoners of war sold, children kidnapped, villages burned in exchange for guns, mirrors, and rum. It wasn't always ignorance. Some knew the fate of those taken, but the price was persuasive. We call it the slave trade, but that's just a polite term. It was a global investment scheme, built on unpaid labor, protected by laws, promoted by kings, and forgotten by design. From the moment the first shackles locked, resistance began. Some resisted with silence, others with fire. Some starved themselves, some leapt into the sea, believing their souls would fly back to Africa on the wings of ancestors. On plantations across the Americas, slaves fought back in every way they could. They broke tools, poisoned crops, sabotaged machinery, practiced secret religions in whispers, spoke in hidden codes, preserved forbidden rhythms in their music. Their very existence was resistance. But sometimes, resistance became rebellion. In 1791, in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, enslaved Africans lit a match that would change the world. They burned the fields, fought with stolen weapons, crushed the slave-owning class with pure will. At their head was Toussaint Louverture, a former slave turned general. They didn't just rebel, they won. And by 1804, Saint-Domingue became Haiti, the first black republic, the first nation born from a slave revolt. In Jamaica, rebels like Queen Nanny of the Maroons led entire communities into the mountains, fighting British forces for decades. In Brazil, quilombos, villages of escaped slaves, grew into independent zones of freedom. In the US, rebellions erupted. Gabriel's Rebellion, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, all daring to dream of freedom, even if it meant death. And in 1839, a group of captives aboard the slave ship Amistad did the unthinkable. They revolted, killed the captain, took the ship, tried to return home. They were captured, jailed, and taken to trial in America, obtaining, but with the help of former President John Quincy Adams, they won. The US Supreme Court ruled in their favor. They were not slaves, they were men, and they returned to Africa. Resistance wasn't just on the battlefield. It was in books, on stages, in churches and courtrooms. Former slaves like Equiano, Truth, and Douglas used their voices as weapons. They forced the world to listen. Freedom was never given. It was fought for, whispered for, bled for. The enslaved were not passive victims of history. They were the spark that forced the system to burn. But when the flames began to rise, the world didn't suddenly grow a conscience. They saw the fire and started calculating how to control it. History tells us it was morality that ended the slave trade. That nations suddenly woke up and realized slavery was wrong, that they abolished it out of virtue. But the truth is murkier than that. Yes, there were heroes: Wilberforce, Clarkson, Granville Sharp, British men of conscience who, camping for years, risked reputation, fought in Parliament. They mattered. Their voices mattered. But their voices alone did not end slavery. Behind the speeches was a changing world. The British Empire, once drunk on slave-grown sugar, was now shifting. Machines were replacing plantations. Wages were cheaper than chains. Empires were seeking new kinds of domination. And the slave trade was becoming less profitable. In 1807, Britain passed the Slave Trade Act. It banned the trade, not slavery itself. And soon after, British warships began patrolling the West African coast, intercepting illegal slavers. But was it justice or naval dominance disguised as virtue? Because now, Britain controlled the seas and could dictate the morality of others, while keeping its colonies running on slave labor for decades more. In fact, slavery continued. It simply mutated. Instead of chattel slavery, Europe extracted palm oil for soap, rubber for machines, gold and diamonds for banks. Exploitation didn't end. It just got rebranded. And while moral voices cried out, companies like the Dutch West India Company and the Royal African Company calculated profits. Abolition became a chess move, a way to protect interests, to appear just, while maintaining control. In public, freedom. Behind closed doors, empire. And let's not forget, some of the earliest voices against the trade were African, like King Afonso of the Congo, begging the Portuguese king to stop kidnapping his people, or Olaudah Equiano, whose testimony shook the foundations of Britain. But they are rarely mentioned, because the spotlight was reserved for the white saviors. Abolition did come, but it came late. It came slow, and it came for many reasons, only one of them being morality. Slavery ended on paper, but not in practice. Chains became contracts. Ships became military bases. The whip was replaced by the pen of foreign policy. Neocolonialism, the new face of domination. Today, some African nations are still occupied by their former colonizers. Not openly, but politically, militarily, economically. Foreign troops on African soil. Foreign banks funding elections. Foreign corporations owning the land, while the people starve on top of gold. When African leaders rise up, truly rise up, they are labeled as threats. Muammar Gaddafi envisioned a United States of Africa with its own currency, its own defense, its own future. The West called him a dictator, then bombed his country and left it burning. Not because he was dangerous to his people, but because he was dangerous to their control. Now new voices rise. Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a young leader who said, "No more foreign troops, no more silent suffering." And for that, He is called a threat, a radical, an enemy of stability. But the people call him hope. Africa has always had visionaries, but visionaries are dangerous to empires, because unity means power, and power means independence, and independence means the West can no longer harvest Africa's riches while feeding it lies. What has the African Union accomplished? Where are the results? What are they discussing behind closed doors while people die poor on rich soil? But the real power is in the people, not the puppets, not the generals, not the handshakes on marble floors. It's in the farmers who still plant, the youth who still learn, the mothers who still hope, the people who still resist. The slave trade ended, but the exploitation never stopped, and the fight is not over. But when Africa remembers its strength, its history, its culture, its unity, the world will shift. The end of the slave trade was just the beginning.